Hello, everybody. I'm Jean Latting. You're about to meet Suneel Gupta, who has written a best-selling book that caught my attention immediately. It's called Everyday Dharma: 8 Essential Practices for Finding Success and Joy in Everything You Do. Suneel is a Harvard Medical School visiting scholar, entrepreneur, international host, and best-selling author. You can find out about him in the show notes below. Sunil is about helping people reset, reignite, and find meaning in their work. Here's what grabbed me about what he had to say. He asked, how can organizations excel on the outside if people are exhausted on the inside? Over and over again, I hear people say they are exhausted. Let's listen to what he has to say about that. Hello, Sunil.
Gene, it's so good to be here.
I am so thrilled to have you here. As you know, we struggled to make this work since July,
Yes, it has
but
been a while.
I wasn't giving up because what you have to say, I really wanted our listeners to hear. So, to everybody, this is Sunil Gupta. Did I pronounce that right?
You pronounce it perfectly.
Who has written this marvelous book called Everyday Dharma. I got so excited when I read about the book because I have been thinking, who is taking care of the children?
Hmm.
How are people balancing their life, trying to get ahead in their careers and and still have a satisfying personal life? How is this supposed to work?
Hmm.
And then one day, as though it was a miracle, his book popped up on my feed, and I got so excited. I asked for him to meet with us and be on this podcast right away. I
Well, I'm so glad you
also,
did.
after I got the book, I discovered he has a terrific origin story. So I'll start with that and ask you, why would you write a book called Everyday Dharma in the first place? What led you from where you were to here?
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting, Gene, that you talk about taking care of the children because I wanted to write a book that I would feel fulfilled giving to my daughter, my older daughter is 12 years old, and I wanted to write a book that I could give to her when she left the home, which I know is going to be a few years from now. But, I think the one of the best pieces of writing advice that I ever got was to keep one person in mind when you're writing a book. Even if you feel like it may one day sell millions of copies, write it for one person, and the person that I wrote it for was my daughter. I was seeing sort of the world that she was growing up in. I have two daughters. I have a 7-year-old as well. But for the 12-year-old, I was just starting to see her in her preteen years, and I was starting to see the pressures already at that age. And it reminded me a lot of my first trip to India where I felt like, in a lot of ways, going from Detroit, where I grew up, and I grew up in Detroit in the 1980s when it was, was thriving, and went back to New Delhi to go spend time with my grandfather, and just it almost felt like I was going back in time. And what I remember most from that trip is sitting with him on his front porch. He was a man of very few words, but when he spoke, it always made it count. And we would sit on his porch, and one day it was morning time, and we were sort of watching the streets of New Delhi wake up. So, the rickshaw drivers were firing up their engines. There was fruit cart vendors who were sort of pushing their carts across the street, and we could see them. And people were starting to sort of come alive into the streets, and they were getting more crowded. And he pointed to the Indian flag, which was waving, far in the distance, but close enough for me to see. And he said, "Hey, can you tell me about this flag? Do you know what it stands for?" And he started to explain the different colors of the flag, but then he pointed to the middle. And he said, "Right in the middle of the Indian flag is a blue navy wheel." And I looked at it I was about 7 years old at this point, so I could see a little more clearly than I can right now. And he said that Navy wheel is the wheel of Dharma, the wheel of Dharma, and Dharma is your essence. It is who you are,
Essence.
and
Wait,
your
let's,
essence.
I know you're telling the story, but you have to say a little bit more about essence.
Yeah, yeah. So the whole book really is me sort of exploring what it means to have an essence. But the way that I like to think about this is what is that thing about me that is true no matter what? Whether I succeed, whether I fail, it is that thing that makes me light up. So, for me, for example, I know that my essence is to tell stories. Now, I have served as a CEO of a tech company. I have worked as a speechwriter for political candidates. I have written books. I've run for political office myself. But the thing that bound all of that together for me was always telling stories. I love gathering stories and I love telling stories. Now, if I would have told my parents when I was a kid that I wanted to be a storyteller when I grew up, that wasn't going to cut it, right? Because we look for occupation. When we ask a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's doctor, it's lawyer, it's accountant, it's something professional. But what I think we don't do enough of is exploring this essence that we all have, something that makes us come alive no matter how we're expressing it. So I like to take care of people. I like to make people feel good. I like to, explore different parts of the world and how it works. I'm really interested in nature. And once we can connect to that essence, then what I think we can do is find all these different ways to express that essence. So today the way I spend my days is I'm speaking on lots of different stages. I write every single day. I do a lot of podcasts like this, but the thing that binds it all together is storytelling. So in the book, we start chapter one with this idea of how do we start to kind of tap back into that essence. And my goal in the book was really to tell the stories of everyday people, along with people we would recognize as well, from Toni Morrison to Jimi Hendrix to Dr. Martin Luther King, but also the stories of firefighters and janitors and nurses who were able to take a step back in their life while continuing to do their duties and figure out what it is that their essence was really telling them to go do.
Okay, so let's go back to your grandfather. That's a beautiful explanation of essence. I didn't want you to go further without that
Yeah.
being clear.
Sure, yeah. So, for Bauji, my grandfather, what he said to me is like, Dharma is your essence. And if you think about this in the wheel of Dharma, what ends up happening is that when you're purely in the center of your wheel, you have a wheel, I have a wheel. When we're purely in the center of that wheel, we're tapped into that essence. We know what it is. But the challenge, as you and I both know, Gene, is that life speeds up. And every year that wheel starts to turn faster and faster and faster. More responsibilities, more duties, more things that are tugging us away from who we are because we're simply just trying to keep up. We're trying to pay the bills, pay the mortgages, take care of our kids. A lot of us taking care of aging parents. Who we don't have time necessarily to reflect on our essence. The message that he had for me is just beware of that. Beware that that's going to happen. You're going to get pulled away from this part of you. And when you realize that's happened, just also understand that at any point in time, it's never too late to take a reflective moment and to come back to who you really are.
Okay, so as you in leadership development, there's a lot of talk about authenticity.
Yeah.
Would you relate essence to authenticity?
I would because, when you're expressing your essence, you come alive in a brand new way, right? You feel creative, you feel lit up, and you feel integrated. When you are uh, taking this part of you that you love, that is really kind of who you are, and you're bringing it into your day to day. You're not waiting for years to pass before you say, "Hey, one day I'm going to go express this part of me." But you're finding even little ways to express that, you start to come alive in a brand new way. So one of the stories that ended up becoming my favorite in the whole book was about a nurse named Karen Struck. And Karen, had worked her way up into becoming the head of an ER inside a major hospital. So she was running a large nursing unit. So clearly very good at what she did, but she was feeling like something was missing, and she couldn't really figure out what that was. So, what she started to do, and we talk about this as an exercise that any of us can put into practice, is she started to tune into these little sparks in her day. So, if her day was starting to feel more like a grind, what were the little moments, even if they were fleeting, even if they were quick, that started to give her these moments of joy? And for her, when she started to tune into these little sparks, what she realized it was when she was filling out patient paperwork. Every time she could write down the story of a patient, talk about not only their clinical condition, but who were they? Who do they love? What did they do at home? What were their hobbies? Whenever she was describing a patient in that type of detail, she found her heart sort of flutter in a certain way. She found her kind of her cheeks would light up in a certain way. She liked the way that felt. And so she started to kind of follow that and say, well, what if I started to do more and more of that? What if I started to put my heart and soul into every time I fill out a patient form and make sure that I'm not just like trying to get through it, but I actually spend a little bit of time kind of digging into it. And that's what she did. And these patient forms, Gene, these really routine, documents became legend inside her hospital system. They were passed around from doctors and nurses. People couldn't wait to read Karen's documents. They couldn't wait to read her forms because they were remind them of the humanity of the work that they were doing, that the people they were actually serving. And that became her thing, right? Her essence was she loved to tell the stories of her patients. The expression of it happened through this routine patient paperwork. It didn't need to be any more than that. But now every day she was expressing her essence in an authentic way.
Okay, so I have a bunch of questions.
Okay.
How did she decide I'm going to notice the flutter in my heart? So that's question one.
Yeah.
Question two, which is just my doctor is in health administration. What about
Mhm.
patient confidentiality? They're passing this stuff around. How are they taking care of that?
Well, the
So,
people who were reading the forms were also the people who were caretaking for the patients as well.
oh, okay.
Right.
Oh, so they
So,
were
right.
they were
So
authorized.
it was so when physicians would say, "Oh gosh, great, I have a patient that Karen also saw," they would light up because they knew they were going to read something that was really interesting and they were going to know some more details about the patient, and there was going to be a humanity to their work. And
So their
I think
hearts fluttered.
their hearts fluttered too. And that's the great thing about Dharma is that when you're finding a way to express your essence, I think you give everybody around you a contact high. When you find ways to sort of bring yourself, you bring more of yourself, even if it has nothing to do with what other people want to do. In her case, it was patient paperwork. It wasn't like a bunch of people said, "Well, I want to go fill out patient paperwork." But I think when you are giving yourself permission to start expressing yourself more fully, um, even subconsciously, people are picking that up and they start to do more of the same themselves. It's one of the most inspiring things you can do is to start to express your essence a little more fully. And we'll talk more about some more techniques too. Your first question was how did she even know to do that? And when I spoke to Karen, one of the things that we spoke a lot about was negativity bias.
Oh,
And the reason that we talked about negativity bias is because, we when I work with lots and lots of leaders, and I work with lots and lots of people who are aspiring to be leaders inside companies too. And one of the things that we often talk about is what is like the rhythm of your days and weeks looking like right now. And what we sort of always realize is when we do an audit, we are very close and tuned in to the things that are not going well in our workday. We know it like the back of our hand. If I'm to go ask somebody right now, if I'm doing a coaching session with somebody, I say, like, tell me about what's going right, what's going wrong. What's going wrong will be very, very clear, right? And it will be very vivid. So in great detail, they'll be able to tell me what's not going well. But what's going well, they'll be able to tell me, but usually it's pretty vague. And the punchline to all of this is that we tend to skip over the moments in our day that are lighting us up because we're so gravitated towards focusing on the stuff that we want to fix, the stuff that's not necessarily going our way. Now, that's not a message. If you're listening to this, that's not a message of, hey, stop and smell the roses necessarily, but it's more about we're giving up really good information. Oftentimes, when we think about purpose and we think about passion, we sometimes think that it's going to come to us through these lightning bolt moments. Like one day you're going to wake up and you're going to say, hey, like, that's the thing that I have been meant, that like I was put here to do. And what I've realized after studying, hundreds, if not thousands at this point of people through my books of like, how do these stories, how do these origin stories come about? How did you discover that this is what you love to do? Very rarely was it the lightning bolt moment. And more often it was these little hints, these little whispers almost that were happening through the day. But the challenge is that most of us are so fixated on fixing things that we miss out on the whispers. And as a nurse, I think Karen sort of, I think, had enough sort of clinical knowledge, was interested enough in, the psychology of negativity bias, where she said, well, am I glossing over the
So
things that
she
are
thought
actually
this
going my way?
herself.
She
She
taught it
thought this.
herself.
She just,
When she learned about negativity bias, she's like, how do I start to kind of tune more into the things that are going well? And just by doing that, that's when she ended up finding sort of like, hey, there are these little moments. And by the way, it wasn't just patient paperwork, it was other things as well. But what she found was like that was one clear thing that she could pick up on. So one of the activities, very specific, that I have people do now.
before we go into how to do it,
Yeah.
I want to stay with that. I coach so many people who feel frustrated in their jobs. I'm not sure if I belong here. I don't know, but I love the paycheck. I love the
Yeah.
security of the paycheck, but I'm not sure that I belong here. From what you're saying, that's highly common. I have thought that that's situationally induced. That is, that this society and this organization sets it up so people want to make money and want to hold a steady job, but
Yeah.
it's contrary to who we are, which was part of
Yeah.
why I was so excited when I saw your book.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
saying that individuals don't have to be stuck.
Precisely. And that we can use whatever job it is that we have, including one that we may not like, to start to get more information about what is it that you do like. Simply by paying attention to the rhythm of your days, to these little moments where you do actually feel lit up. That's really good information to have. And one of the things that I tell people, particularly those who are, pretty fresh out of college, they're relatively new into the workforce, or they didn't go to college and they went straight into the workforce, is like they feel like their job is a drag. That's fine. You don't have to stick with that job, but make sure that you also tune into what are the things that are happening right now that you do enjoy, so that when you look for your next opportunity, you start to shape the rest of your path. You're not simply going in with, I don't want this. You're not simply running away from something. You know what you're actually running towards as well.
Okay, so I want to distinguish between what brings me joy and what I might be good at,
Yeah, good
because most people
distinction.
choose what they think they're good at,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
may not bring them joy. So you already know what I'm talking about. So how do you respond to someone says, "But suppose I'm not that good at what brings me joy"?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's like to me one of the most beautiful things, which is that you have this thing that you love that brings you joy, and you have this huge opportunity to get better at it. And I think ultimately like that's what I think, we're here to do, which is really to express our essence, not to achieve necessarily with our essence, not to hit some kind of destination with our essence, but to express our essence. And so for me, for example, writing was never really in my wheelhouse. Writing books certainly wasn't in my wheelhouse. And when I first started out with it, I was terrible at it. I was rejected many, many times by editors and agents, and because I would share with them samples, and it just wasn't good enough. But I loved the craft of sitting down every day and writing. that was something that nobody could take away from me, right? And again, like the feedback I was getting externally was you're not sort of ready to be a professional writer. But what I was really tuned into is, gosh, like two things. One, I'm getting much better at this. I know it. I can feel it. Like I can see my sentences form in better ways. I can see my storytelling getting sharper. But the second thing is like I really enjoyed it.
So
So
you
I think that
stuck with it even though you got all that negative feedback.
well, yeah, because for me, like I think that this is part of I think the crux of the book, Gene, which is like, where are you getting your validation? Are you getting your validation
Yeah.
externally, or are you getting it internally? But the real thing for me is that it's not either or. It's both. Like I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to seek praise. I don't think there's anything wrong with, wanting to get a promotion or be told that you're very good at what you do. Those are all human things. The problem with that though is that if it's only external validation, that is you're putting yourself really kind of reliant on other people. You're making yourself reliant on all these systems that are outside of your control. So it's almost like in some ways like you have a jetpack, and that jetpack can only fly if people are validating you, if they're giving you promotions, if they're giving you more money. The point of this book is not to remove that jetpack, but it's almost in some ways to add another engine to it. And that engine is internal validation. And this internal validation is coming to you via the feeling that you get when you do something, right? And so even if you're not being externally validated, you know this is something that is lighting you up, then that is worth pursuing. It is worth getting better at. You may not hit targets, you may not hit goals, you may not hit the things that you sort of feel like you should be hitting. But what I've found is that more often than not, when people follow this path of internal validation, two things happen. One is that they're really lit up, and they tend to do really good work, right? Because it's like it's
That
something that you love
reinforced.
to do, right? And the second is that you it's a journey that you want to continue, right? Meaning that it's not something that you need to sort of set down because you're being rejected. You have this fuel inside of you that is keeping you going. And we know that when we look at these successful stories, it's the myth of the overnight success, right? People have been going for years on projects before they end up getting any type of external validation. What was keeping them going during that time? Was it really the promise that one day they were going to get that goal, get that reward? Maybe part of it was that. But the bigger thing in my experience now, after studying all these people that had these incredibly long journeys to success, was that they were doing something that they could internally validate, meaning they were doing something that they felt like, oh, this is actually lighting me up right now in this moment. I don't have to wait for some type of validation in the future.
Okay, so I really want to stay on this point
Yeah.
because I've talked to people, a lot of people, as you're saying. And what happens is they get all the feel goods, what you're calling internal validation. They get all of the feel goods from engaging in the activity, but then nothing happens. They think I'm wasting my time. I need to be productive. This is not productive. How do you cross that barrier?
Yeah. I think the first thing is you can this isn't something that you need to do necessarily full time, right? So for all of us, we still have our duties. We still have our bills to pay. Like we have to ground this in reality. Toni Morrison is another person I write about in the book. She was a single mom, really trying to sort of make her world work. She took the bus to work every single day, raising two kids that she would write on the bus every single day. And she turned that into a rhythm. And, these little pieces of paper that she would write on the bus ended up forming into paragraphs and eventually into chapters and eventually into books, right? But there's a rhythm and a discipline that she brought into it. And the point is that oftentimes we we are half-hearted with the thing that we are sort of trying to do, right? We're kind of one foot in, one foot out. And what I have found, it is much, much better to be partially scheduled and full-hearted than it is to be half-hearted and fully scheduled, right?
All
So
right, say that again. I love
yes, yeah, so it is much better to be full-hearted and partially scheduled with your dharma, with this essence, than it is for you to be partially hearted, half-hearted with something and be fully scheduled. So I know what it's like to go at something, right, and sort of be consumed by it in terms of time, but also be one foot in, one foot out, right? And so I'm not all in on it. And I realize that that's a recipe for disaster, right? It's not great. I've taken jobs, for example, that I knew I wasn't it wasn't in my wheelhouse. I knew that it wasn't the thing that I wanted to go do. So I'd sit at my desk day after day and I would sort of be half-hearted with it, but I was giving it all my time, right? And it led to a certain level of productivity that wasn't very high. But I also know what it's like to wake up a half hour early every morning before that day job and to be full-hearted with one thing, right? For me, that was writing. I want to be full-hearted with writing for a half hour every day. And gosh, I mean, Gene, the output, like the like it seems small to give a half hour to something every day, but if you do it every single day, the compounding that that creates. I was amazed after just a few months of how much I had written, but more importantly, how much I had grown. And so, I think a lot of us are struggling right now because we're in jobs we don't like, and we're trying to figure out what this essence is. And the greatest advice that I can give you is to start experimenting with different things, but also choose one thing at a time. So if you love to paint, if you love to speak, if you love to write, if you love to tinker with inventions or tinker with code, start giving that full-hearted devotion every single day, even if it's just for a few minutes every day. Right? That rhythm, that repetition is far more important than saying, hey, you know what, 4 years from now, when I finally have time, I'm going to go dig into that for a year. That can still happen, but there's no reason why you can't give it a rhythmic repetition right now and start bringing it into your life. And here's the amazing thing. I know I'm being long-winded here, but here's the amazing thing. When you do that, what ends up happening is that the other parts of your day start to come alive as well. I know that sounds strange, but if you work a job that you don't like, but you're giving your essence, just a little bit of love every day, focus love, it actually brings you more love towards the job that you don't like. Like you
Yeah,
show
because
up
I
in a different
paid
way.
myself. I paid myself first.
I pay myself first, and my world no longer feels so constrained. What you've done is you've liberated yourself, and you've given yourself more dimension, and more importantly, you've taken this thing that inside of you has just been waiting to be expressed. It's bottled up, and you're giving it a way to express itself every single day. It starts to breathe a little bit easier.
Okay, so these people that I'm thinking of, I'm literally, as you're talking, people faces are popping up in my
Yeah,
brain of folks who feel stuck. And what you're saying is, don't wait until you saved up enough money and can leave your job. Don't wait until you have time. If Toni Morris can write on the bus on her way to her job and do it every day, you have an equivalent activity that you can find a way to work in what lights you up.
that's right.
And do it now is what you're saying.
Do
Like,
it now.
okay, so here's the second place. That's real clear. Second place where people get stuck, this one thing at a time. I'm thinking now of two people who have four different things that light them up. And so they dabble and dabble.
I'm loving this conversation, Gene. You're asking such good questions. I love this. By the way, I was one of those people. I was resentful of the idea that I needed to choose one thing in
There
life,
we go. That's it.
right?
That's it.
Because I'm multidimensional and we all are, right? We've got all these things that we want to do. I hated the idea that I would have to choose one career path. What I have come around to is that it is true that focus is paramount. Like nothing good will come without being full-hearted with something, right? I believe that. I've learned it the hard way. I've seen many, many instances now of people who have tried to sort of spread themselves too thin, and it hasn't worked as well as when they gained focus. However, that does not necessarily mean that you have to do that one thing for the rest of your life either. So let me give you an example. Um, with speaking, for example, I didn't know if being on stage and speaking was going to be my thing, but I it always intrigued me. I had spent some of my early career as a speechwriter, and I wondered what it would be like to be on the other side of the podium speaking, right? Now, nobody had ever validated me as a speaker, but it was something that I was interested in really kind of pursuing. And I sort of had it always as kind of a side kind of activity, which was fine. I was giving it a little bit of time here, a little bit of time there. I was taking opportunities whenever I could speak at work. I would raise my hand and go do that, and that was good. But the year that I eventually sort of broke out as a speaker was when I said, you know what, this year I'm gonna give myself this one full year and I'm gonna do everything I can to really hone myself as a speaker. And what that means is all these other things that I have on my plate, I want to go build this company or I have this idea for this thing. I'm going to put that to the side for right now. It's in my backlog. It's not going anywhere, but I'm going to focus on this one thing for 1 year. I have come
Oh,
around to
you
calling this thing, I've come around to calling what I just described to you a tiny contract. A tiny contract. I'm making a tiny contract with myself to be really committed, dedicated, and devoted to this thing for a certain period of time. Right. Now, again, if you have a full-time job, you can still have a tiny contract on the side as well, right? You might have a side hustle, you might have a side thing. But what you're saying is that I'm going to devote myself with the time that I have available. I'm going to devote myself to this thing that I know that I'm really passionate about. And as a result of that, I'm going to take these other things and I'm going to put them in my backlog. Now, after that 1 year is up, or whatever the time frame is, it doesn't have to be 1 year, it could be 18 months, it could be 3 months, but you're agreeing on a contract, and that contract has a time frame to it where you're saying, I'm going to be devoted to this one thing. When that is over, you can sort of reevaluate and say, hey, is this lighting me up in the way that I thought it would? And if it's not, or if it's not meeting sort of the other goals you have for it, you can put that in the backlog and you can pull something else out. But I do think it
would
is
you
really important.
stick to it? How did you stick to it?
I stick to it knowing that for me that 1 year is has an end date. Because I think where it ends up getting really tricky is when we say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to do these other things. I'm just going to do this forever, right?
Okay.
That's when it starts to feel really intimidating, right? When we start to have these sort of these what I think are really sort of false time constructs where it's like forever I'm going to be doing this. No, it's not forever. But at the same time, I think we can use the idea of time to our advantage. We can constrain it and we can say, listen, I can't do multiple things well at once. But what I can do is I can do one thing well for multiple months, right? And
I love that.
right? And so let me figure out how many months it is that I want to set for this contract. In the book, I talk about this automotive, this automotive employee who would do this every year. Now, I asked him, he worked at Ford Motor Company. He'd been working there for 30 years. And I said, well, how much longer are you going to be working there? He said, I don't know. Right now, it's 1 year. It'd take it 1 year increments. And what he would do is he had a spot that he loved to go to in Wisconsin by a lake, and he would go there with his wife, and he had been doing this for 20 years. And every summer, they would take 1 week off. He would take 1 week of vacation. He would go to that lake and he would go sit by the lake and he'd say, is this what I want to do for another year? And if the answer was yes, then he'd go back and he'd do it for another year. And if the answer was no, he wouldn't do it for another year. Now, the reason I like that is because most of us are thinking about the long, long term. We're saying, hey, like, is this what I want to be doing for the rest of my life? That's a hard question to answer because everything is changing so quickly. The world is changing, the opportunities are changing, the market is changing, and most importantly, you are changing. So for you to answer the question right now, am I doing right now what I want to be doing for the rest of my life? Almost seems like kind of an unfair hurdle for you mentally to have to go over. But to say, hey, am I doing what I want to be doing for a year or for 2 years or whatever the time horizon is that feels really nice for you, really safe for you? I think that that's a reasonable thing, right? So for us, I think what we can do is we can start to bring in this construct of time a little bit and to say, all right, let me commit wholeheartedly, full-heartedly to something, but let me do it for a fixed period of time, knowing that this thing that we am committing to has an end date and I always have the ability to reevaluate.
I did. I was in academia for 35 years, 1 year at a time.
Great.
Every year
Yeah,
I said, I think I'm going to do this another year. And I did that all the way up to various promotions and all until I retired.
I love it.
1 year. And I thought at the time, people said, how long I'm going to be here forever. And I'm thinking, I don't know what forever looks like. I know I'm here now and I know I'll be here next year, but I've never seen forever. So,
I love that. And I wish I would have known that earlier in my career because what ends up happening as a result, too, is when you sort of come to each 1 year increment and you say, all right, I'm going to do this for another year. You make that tiny contract with yourself. What happens is you come back with this new level of energy, right? Because you've recommitted now for another year. And I compare that to people who are like, well, I'm in this job and I don't know how long I'll be here. We'll see. And it's just kind of like, you know, there's a certain level of energy that goes with that as well. And what I find is that the people who are kind of recommitting to themselves through these tiny contracts, there's a whole different way that they're vibrating. There's a whole different level of energy that they tend to bring into their work because it feels very deliberate. It feels very intentional.
okay, so let's move into talking about being uncomfortable. You do a great, great job of expressing what I call being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Can you talk about that? Because to do what you're saying to do, people have to be willing to be uncomfortable.
Yes. Yes. So, in the book, in both of my books, I've talked about this idea of the game of now. And the game of now is a mindset. And the mindset is that you don't have to wait for courage in order to take action. You can take action and you can let courage catch up along the way, right?
Yeah.
And if you look, my biggest mistake in as a researcher, as I started to kind of really go out there and understand how people got to where they were, how they succeeded at a high level. My biggest mistake was in believing that in some way they were ready to take that leap. So the way that I sort of organized my research was, how did you get ready to go do the thing that you went to go do? And after a while, I kind of realized, well, I'm on a fool's errand here because the vast majority of people were not ready. They simply took action. So, three friends from design school were not ready to start Airbnb. Two bagel shop managers weren't ready to become Ben and Jerry's. Malala Yousafzai, she wasn't ready at 11 years old to start speaking out against the Taliban. Like, and these stories, they go on and on and on. More often than not, when you see a success story, it is not because they were ready and then they took action. They took action, and this idea of readiness and courage caught up along the way, right? And so that to me is the flip, right? And you know, it's one of those things, Gene, where I go around the world, I study all these people, and I realize that the story that exemplifies this the best was the one that was closest to me all along. So my mom grew up in poverty. She was a refugee. She ended up sort of deciding at some point in time that she wanted to move to the United States and she wanted to become an engineer with Ford Motor Company. And literally her village started a collection pot. And she would sort of like convince people to put little pieces of money into that pot, and eventually it grew big enough where she was able to get to the United States. She was able to get her
Whoa.
a scholarship to Oklahoma State University. She was able to get herself to Detroit, Michigan. She was rejected multiple times. But in 1967, she achieved her dream. She became an engineer with Ford Motor Company. And to me, what that meant was I grew up in privilege that she had never seen ever before, right? I grew up in suburban Detroit in a pretty safe suburb. going to a decent public school, never had to worry about a meal, whereas my mom had no running water, no electricity. And so one of the things that I always sort of like felt was, wow, I'm in such admiration of my mom's story. But at the same time, there was always a part of me that felt like, wow, like what a letdown I must be because I don't feel nearly as courageous or brave as she does. And I just felt that I was this wimpy sort of suburbanite, But one day I had a conversation with her about courage, and I asked her, like, how did you have the courage to go do all these things? And she said to me, like, I didn't. I was afraid. I was afraid at every single step of the way. And the only thing that I did that was different from all the other people that wanted to get out of poverty themselves is I just started taking little actions. I just started taking little moves, making little moves, and move after move. And it's a cycle, right? Every time you make a move towards something that you really like, a little bit of courage will follow, and then that gives you the courage to make another move, and then you get a little more courage, and the cycle begins to spin. It begins to spin, and it begins to spin. I have seen this story. I've seen a version of my mom's story so many times now.
That's
I'm
my
guessing
life.
you have a version of that story, Gene.
Yeah, that's my life. That's my book that was just released in July. I said, this book needs to be written, but I don't have time to do it. And then one day I said, well, let me write these people and see if they'd be contributors. And then
Oh,
people responded. And then I thought, I don't have time. And then my co-author for my first book retired and it was during COVID and said, Jean, can I help you do in your work? And I said, this book. And so it happened. But each step is just exact. I'm just so excited. I hadn't thought, I thought this is me fumbling along. I had defined it as Jean fumbling her way through life.
oh, I love it. Well, I mean, action leads to courage. That is, that is, if you're going to take one thing from this conversation, if you're listening, that's it. Action leads to courage.
And
You
you
know,
don't have to have the courage first.
you don't have to have the courage first, and that's where you were asking about discomfort, right? And I think that's where most of the discomfort comes in because we feel like we need to have that courage. And if we don't have that courage, or if we have fear, if we have doubt, then something must be wrong, right? And the truth is, nothing is wrong. Nothing is wrong. And that feeling that you have is also highly compatible with action. I was surprised when I really started to dig into Dr. King's story. And the part of me that surprised me the most was when I started to see it through the lens of some of his closest followers, and Marian Edelman in particular, who I write about in the book. And, Marian Edelman spoke about how when she was a college student, Dr. King had visited her campus and she was expecting to see this guy who was going to be inspiring, who was going to be sort of commanding, who was going to sort of lay out the roadmap of here's what's going to happen in the civil rights movement. And I've got the plan. Follow me. I have confidence it will work. And what she saw was the exact opposite of that. What she wrote about is somebody who was very timid, who was very uncertain. And she thought to herself, like, how could this be? This is the guy who's in charge of it all. Like, this is the person who we have at the helm. But what she ultimately ended up finding is that like that was the most inspiring thing of all, was to see a person who was uncertain, who didn't necessarily, who wasn't necessarily fearless, who had a lot of doubt, but at the same time, that did not prevent him from taking step after step after step. And the line that he told Marion and others is, I don't have to see the full staircase. I just need to take the next step, right? And oftentimes, I think we get conditioned to believe that we need to see the full staircase. We need to know the
Yes,
last
I need
step.
to know it's all going to
We need to
work
know
out.
the last step before we take the next step. We are a society, I think, that is almost addicted to planning, right? To projections. And so if you don't know what that last step looks like, then clearly you must not know what you're doing. But the truth is that very rarely does a plan go to, go the way it was intended to go, right? Things always sort of twist and turn. That's true for, companies, that's true for people, it's certainly true for leaders. The vast majority of successful leaders have pivoted in their career. The vast majority of successful startups have pivoted at least once, have changed course at least once before they got to a place of success. That is more of the rule of nature, is that we cannot know the last step. But when we sort of put a condition into our lives that we must know what that last step looks like before we take the next step, that's what locks us into place. That's what sticks us to where we are.
And I know three people have just flashed my head right now, said, well, I can't do this until I know what's going to happen over here. And I said, just move, just do something, just go. But people can't do that. Now,
Yeah,
do you know the difference why some people, you had your mother as a role model,
I did. I
right?
did. I'm so
I
grateful.
come from a family, generations of entrepreneurs who just did it, not knowing if they were going to be killed sometimes, but
Hmm.
just did it. So you had that. What of people? I'm thinking now of a friend who is scared that anything she does will be wrong if she doesn't know exactly the
Yeah,
right thing.
yeah. So one thing that's very helpful for me is to reframe any type of to do as a to learn.
Ah,
So what I mean
love
by that,
that. Oh,
right? So
that gives me goosebumps. Yes.
yeah, and it's so simple, but just so effective because, I sat down with Bill Gates and he said that failure is it's not something that you necessarily look out for, but the one thing is that it's a very, very good teacher, right?
Yes. If you let it be.
And success is a lousy teacher, right? While as wonderful as it is a lousy teacher. And so when we start to think about, hey, there's something that we want to go do, but we're scared to go do it. What is the goal that you have in mind, right? And how do you reframe that goal from a to do, something you have to go accomplish, to a to learn? So, practical example. For me, when I was starting to write a book, I had a very difficult time. And I know I mentioned this earlier in the interview, but internally, I said that I was getting lit up, but I also had a lot of anxiety. And part of the reason I had anxiety is because I had this goal of I've got to go write a book, right?
Oh,
And
this
I was like,
great big book.
I've got to go write this book, and eventually I'm gonna have to have agents. I'm gonna have to have like, my goal is to go write a book. And eventually I got the advice from a mentor of what if instead of every day saying I need to go write a book, your sort of goal was you want to learn how to become a better writer, right? And that was your thing, right? You're gonna become a better writer. You're gonna learn how to become a professional writer. As soon as I made that shift, the anxiety inside of me, the fear went down significantly. Now, one question you might have if you're listening is, well, did your drive go with it too? Did you stop trying? Absolutely not. Like I sat down every single day, just the same way I did before, with the objective of how do I become a book writer? How do I become a better, like somebody who could do this professionally? What that meant is I had to write every single day, right? I had to get better every single day. I was still doing the work, but it was coming from a different source. And I never felt like on a given day that I wasn't getting closer now to my goal because my goal was no longer to go do something, but it was to learn something. And by the way, all the things that I learned were ultimately the things that ended up helping me go do it. So that's how I got my first book published.
That's beautiful. Okay, so way back when you were going to talk about exercises. And I
Yeah.
said, no, we need background before we get into the exercises. So we got the background. What's an exercise? You get an idea of the person I'm talking about. You've met many of them, I can tell.
Yeah.
What's a great exercise for someone listening to you right now saying, oh, well, but I don't know how, if I can do it and how I should get
Mm.
started?
Mm. Okay, so let's talk first about essence because like I think one of the things that sometimes people who come to me say is like, but I don't know my essence. I don't know
That's
what that thing
yeah.
is, right? So I think it's important to sort of begin there, and then we can talk about steps for starting to
Okay.
express that. So one practical activity that has worked very well from the people that I coach is every day start to jot down the little moments in your day that are bringing you these little moments of joy, right? And again, the joy can be fleeting. It's just what you're looking for is little sparks. Customato, who was Mike Tyson's boxing coach, what he would say is he would always look for the little spark inside an athlete, and once he found that little spark, he could turn that spark into a flame, and then he could fan that flame until it turned into a roaring fire. And I think essence is very much the same thing, right? It's these little sparks. And again, very easy to dismiss, very easy to gloss over, ignore. So what you're doing is you're almost becoming a detective of your own inner state for a few days. And every time you feel a little bit of a spark, you feel a little bit of an energetic hit, and somatically, like in your body, I want you to jot that down on a piece of paper, right? I like to keep a little notebook, these little field notes with me. I have it in my back pocket and I write it down, right?
I have a
And
journal on my phone.
or you can just
Big
journal on
fan.
your phone. You can open up a little note on your phone, and so what you're doing this is you're doing this for your every day, and you're doing it for at least 5 days. And what you're targeting generally is at least 3 moments in the day when you're starting to feel that. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily have to be professional. It could be, for me, I take a walk with my daughter every night after dinner, whenever we can, whenever we're in town. And it's like, it always gives me that spark. It always gives me that joy. We hold hands, we walk down the street. It's a very short walk, but like that always gives me joy. And that's always going to belong on my list. But what you're doing is you're capturing these little moments throughout your day. And at the end of 5-ish days, what that means is you're going to have somewhere, around 20 different data points. You're going to have 20 of these little moments. And I want you to examine that list of 20, that master list you've created. And I want you to start to look for patterns, right? What are the things that came up over and over again? But try to go beneath the surface as well and say, what are the commonalities between these things? Am I starting to see some patterns? Oh, this one over here actually relates to this one over here, right? So for example, when I worked with an accountant who did this exercise, what he was finding is that visual things were really popping for him. Whenever he was able to sort of work with like a visual document, right? Like that was interesting to him. Or he's able to create a visual, even to draw something on a whiteboard. That was interesting. He said, wow, like there's this part of me that is very visual that as an accountant I wasn't even really tapping into. So how do I now start to bring more of like these visuals, this artistic side of me into a day, right? Even as an accountant, there are opportunities to do that. So again, what you're doing is you're paying attention to what are the patterns, what are the patterns there, right? And be
Okay.
patient. Be patient
Before
with
you
it as well.
okay, before you go further, let's
Yeah.
handle the objection of why do I have to write it down anyway? Why can't I just think about it in my head and figure it out?
Yeah, the main reason for that is because we are not very good at storing good memories. We're very good at storing negative memories. But when it comes to positive things, we can dismiss them very, very quickly. We were talking a little bit about this before, Gene, but my first book, one of the groups that I studied was professional poker players. It was a book called Backable, and I was trying to sort of figure out sort of like how different people get their ideas across. And I stumbled upon a group of championship poker players, and I started to sort of interview them and study them. And one of the things I would ask them is like, tell me about the hands that you won, right? Tell me about the hands that like the championship rounds you actually won. What was the feeling like? And what I was surprised by is that they were able to describe that with very little detail. They could tell me generally where the location was, what the name of the competition was, but then I would ask them about the hands that they lost, right? The hands where they got almost to the final round, but they didn't quite make it. And with Shakespearean detail, they could tell me
Oh,
everything
that's
about the hands that they lost,
fascinating,
right?
Sunil.
They could tell me the clothes they were wearing. They could tell me the clothes the other people around the table were wearing. They could tell me the temperature inside the casino. There were so many little vivid details they could share about these moments that did not go their way. Why? Because we are very good at creating this like rich, almost Netflix style repository of negative memories, but we're not as good at storing positive memories, right? And it's just the way we're wired because we're trying to protect ourselves from threats. We're trying to make sure that we can avoid them, right? And so it's part of our built-in defense mechanism. But it doesn't necessarily A, make us happier, and B, it doesn't necessarily give us the complete set of information that we need when we start to think about things like purpose and passion, right? So we need to start tuning into detail, the same fidelity of detail, these positive moments as the ones that we sort of that we that don't go our way. And one of the ways to do that, getting back to your initial question, is by writing it down, right? Because I don't trust the human brain, especially right now. I don't trust the human brain to be able to absorb that detail and to be able to recall it. So list making is very important when you're trying to figure out what it is that lights you up.
Okay. Well, I am, I feel like I've been bathed in warm water. This is within a ray of sunshine. This has been marvelous. What are three takeaways you want listeners to think about or do? Either one.
Yeah, well, let's start with the most important one. Action leads to courage. You
Okay.
don't have to be fearless. You don't have to be rid of your doubts in order to go take action. You can do that today. So, the practical takeaway. What is that thing that you want to do but have been afraid to do? And what is the simplest step that you can take today to get that wheel in motion? Um, just again, one step more practical. There was somebody the other day who said, "Look, I've got an idea for a business and I want to make a move on it. I want to do it, but like I just keep getting caught in inertia. I've got a day job, I've got all this stuff." And I said, "Okay, listen, this is what you're going to do. You're going to call a friend and you're going to say to this friend, 'Hey, 3 weeks from now, I want to share a new idea with you.' Okay? We're going to put it on the calendar and I'm not going to tell you what it is right now. You're going to ask, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. But 3 weeks from now, I'm going to. It's on both of our calendars now, and now there's this thing. There's this forcing function. That's one baby step that you have taken. And now what that's done is it's sort of created momentum. Now you have to go research the idea a little bit more. Now you have to start to think about how you're going to describe it. There are some steps that you need to take. So just figuring out what is the simplest thing that you can do today and go do that thing, right? And remember that action leads to courage, right? Not the other way around. Action leads to courage. The second thing is to really tune into your energy because we talk a lot about passion, we talk a lot about purpose, but the reality is that if you're burnt out, you can't necessarily pursue those things. I know plenty of people who have great purpose in their life, but they're just exhausted, right? And
Yes.
when I look at leaders who tend to fizzle out in their careers, it's not because they ran out of time or talent, it's because they ran out of energy. And so we have to, when we think about a life of purpose, also take care of ourselves because you are the engine, right? And what that means practically is that you cannot wait for vacations or long breaks
Yeah,
to give
that's
yourself periods of
so
rest.
right. Yes. Yes.
The average high performer that I have studied is taking somewhere around 8 breaks every single day, 8 small breaks.
Yes.
And they could be tiny. I remember I sat down with Martha Stewart, and she's 82 years old, and she has the energy of a 22-year-old. But part of the reason that she has that, she works incredibly long days. And part of the reason she's able to make this work is because throughout the day she's taking these micro breaks. She's gardening, she's playing with her pets, she's walking around her property, she's doing things that restore her. So the way that I like to think about it is that for every 55 minutes of work, whenever possible, not always possible, but whenever 55 minutes of work, you're building in 5 minutes of focused, deliberate rest. 55 to 5. And during that 5 minutes, you could be doing anything you want. You could be walking, you could be stretching, you could be listening to music, you could be sipping on a cup of coffee, whatever it is that restores you. But whatever that thing is, sink into that. Give it your full heart. Give that 5 minutes your full heart, right? And then return back. And what's going to happen is that those 5 minutes are going to make the other 55 minutes far more productive, far more creative, far more collaborative. All these things that we associate with success. So really kind of focus on that. And the third thing that I would leave you with is, one of the chapters in my book is called Lila, which is the sense of high play and bringing a sense of play into your work.
Mm.
And I think we as a society have been conditioned, I think especially in the developed part of the world, to feel like the more serious you are, the more likely you are to achieve an outcome. And by the way, I feel like I spent most of my career believing this. I needed to be serious. I needed to almost be stiff in some ways to get results. And what I realize now is that the opposite is almost always true. And, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote the book Flow, talked a lot about this. This idea of flow in our life cannot come from a place of seriousness. If you're taking it too serious, if you're taking yourself too serious, what happens internally is you almost start to kind of bring your gears to a halt. You start to squeeze too tight. And when you're squeezing that tight, you cannot be a creative spirit, right? You cannot perform at the level that you want to be performing at. So starting to kind of loosen and bring a sense of play and bring a sense of levity to what you do, right, is really, really important. And one of the most practical things that you can do to start to bring more play into your life is before you walk into a moment, whether that be a meeting with coworkers or that be you sitting down at your desk to go heads down on something or spending time with your family, whatever it is, ask yourself, how do I have fun with this?
Ah,
Simply just
deliberately
asking yourself that
cultivate
question.
fun.
Yeah, simply just asking yourself that question. How do I have fun with this moment that I'm about to step into? And the answer will start to come to you. You will start to soften, you will start to lighten, and pay attention to whether that had any impact at all. Did it negatively impact your output? Did you find yourself to not do as good a work? Did you find yourself to do even better work? And I think you will almost certainly find that you can have fun, be light, and you will have longevity with what you want to go do, and you'll have results that you never even imagined.
This has been Sunil. This has been marvelous. More than I had hoped for. And I thank you for your time and your insights. And I agree with everything you said.
Oh.
And you don't know how remarkable that is because I can find a flaw in a heartbeat.
Well, Dr. Jane, I really love your work. I love what you're doing, and your questions are so insightful. And it's just clear to me, like the people who work with you must be very, very lucky because you go to a place of depth, and I'm sure that they really value that. And I've loved this conversation.
All right. Well, thank you. Oh, how can people reach you? I almost forgot.
Yeah, best way is just go to my website. It's just suneelgupta.com. I spell my name Suneelgupta.
Okay. I'll put it in the notes. And thank you.
All right.
I wasn't kidding when I said to Sunil that I felt bathed in warm water. Talking with him was like a breath of fresh air. He has condensed how to truly find your essence, your Dharma, into a prescriptive set of steps that I'm so sure will work. Here are three nuggets that stand out to me. First, he had a wonderful prescription for even how to find your Dharma. He said, notice when you light up, what happened that energized you? Do this for 5 days, 4 times a day, and you'll end up with 20 data points. I'm going to try this myself. I know what I want to do, but I'd love to know what shows up if I try it. Second, he says, action leads to courage. Now, some people say fake it till you make it, but I don't recommend that, and he's not recommending that. Instead of stewing and sitting in fear about something you want to do, say to yourself, I'm going to learn about this. And then, whatever amount of time it takes to learn about, invest that time. This is how I got started in the technology of change. Years ago, I was with a group of people trying to convince them of something that was very important to me, and they were not convinced. I was so dismayed that I said, I'm going to learn what it takes for people to change their minds. And out of that came what is now my life's work. Third, he said, monitor your energy. Notice what's energizing you and what's depleting you. Throughout the day, take micro breaks so that you can keep your energy up. I recommend to my coaching clients take those breaks and Connect with nature as one way of doing it. Run your hands in warm water or look at a plant. Put your feet on the ground. Whatever it takes to bring yourself back. What he's saying is so intertwined with what we're saying in conscious change. He provides the framework for thinking about it in terms of your energy, finding your dharma, and so forth. We talk about the specific skills to make it happen. I hope you pick up a copy of his book, Everyday Dharma. And of course, I hope you pick up a copy of our book, Conscious Change. And email me your comments. We would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.